We got through yesterday all of the gross anatomy, not gross like ew, but like gross like surface. And we're starting to dive into more details here. We started yesterday, just again into the ventricles and the big pieces. Now we're going to dive into some of the details. So we're starting out in the hindbrain and the midbrain. Remember that there's kind of three categories. They divide the brain into the hindbrain, the midbrain, the forebrain. We're starting from the bottom, the caudal, remember, and moving our way more rostrally. Our first piece is the medulla oblongata, which is just a fun word to say. You want to impress your friends? Talk about the medulla oblongata, right? And this is starting at the foramen magnum in the skull. So again, we're starting at the bottom, the most caudal, working our way more toward the top, the most rostral. And it begins at the foramen magnum and extends rostrally about 3 centimeters and ends at the pons. The pons is the next piece of the brain stem. These are all pieces of the brain stem that we're talking about today. And it's slightly wider than the spinal cord. So if we're looking here at the picture, this right here at the very bottom, that is the medulla oblongata. You see kind of the bulgeness of it, right? Versus below that would just be the spinal cord. Some pieces that happen on the medulla oblongata, it's got these things called the pyramids, which are these pair of ridges that run side by side on it. You've got 4 of the cranial nerves that exit at the medulla oblongata. Remember, cranial nerves don't go into the spinal cord. These are nerves that bring motor and sensory to your face mostly, face and upper chest, without going through the spinal cord. So 4 of them come off on the medulla oblongata, number 8, number 9, number 10, number 12. If we're zooming in a little more and putting some color on the brain stem, we're talking about this dark green area down there. That's the medulla oblongata. You see those pyramids, those bulges, like 2 baseball bats running up the center of the medulla. Turn so you can see a little bit differently. So all of our ascending and descending fibers that are coming into and out of the brain, they have to pass through the medulla, which is kind of a duh, because the medulla is right above the spinal cord, right? To get to the brain, you have to go through the medulla. You'll see this in a lot of these brain stem pieces we're talking about. These are pathways, right, that are bringing stuff from the bottom up to the brain itself. Now they're in that medulla. They're not just these pathways. There are also things called the reticular formation. The reticular formation is a loose network of nuclei that extends throughout the medulla and the pons and the midbrain. And these are what contain the centers that control how our heart beats, how our blood vessels respond, like dilating or constricting, and our respiratory centers that keep us breathing. These are like the primary functional pieces, right, to help keep us alive, keep our heartbeat, keep our blood circulating, keep our lungs filling with air. We took that brainstem and we sliced it into a cross section, right? So this is the medulla. Again, still kind of looking like that butterfly back from the spinal cord. But you can see these different areas that have different names to them. Again, I'm not interested. We could... and again, I keep saying this, but we're glossing over so much, right? There's all these different names of these different nuclei and different centers in these different parts of the brain. I just want you to be aware of them. And your textbook, I think, does a great job of showing you those pieces. On page 517 is where this diagram is here, showing you the different pieces that are involved with the medulla. Any questions there? All right, we keep going with the pons then. Again, we're moving more caudally, more rostrally up toward the top, the middle of the brain stem. And the pons is this big anterior bulge. So if you see, here's the medulla, little bulge. The pons is a very distinctive bulge in the middle of the brain stem. It has these pieces on the outside of it called the cerebral peduncles. It's another fun name to say. These thick stalks on the posterior pons that connect it and the midbrain to the cerebellum, because the cerebellum is right posterior to the pons here. And those are the ascending and descending motor and sensory tracts, and also the pathways into and out of the cerebellum. You've got, again, 4 cranial nerves that come off of the pons, number 5, number 6, number 7, and number 8, which play huge roles in our senses, our hearing, our taste, our facial expression, our balance. We'll talk much more about these in the future. And also the reticular formation continues there in the pons. Again, those are those nuclei, those centers that contain the controls for these things that keep us alive, our breathing, our heartbeat, etc. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Some more pictures of the pons. Again, that nice anteriorly bulged, right? Because anterior is on the left side, posterior is on the right side. So it's bulging anteriorly. Here is the cadaver. They have nice orange pons. It's not actually orange in real life, just so you know. Pons, pons, pons. We take a cross section of that pons, which again is there on page 517 in your textbook. You get your first look at one of the ventricles, right? Remember that the ventricles, the spaces we talked about yesterday that are filled with cerebral spinal fluid? It's extending all the way down into the pons here. You can see the tracts that are moving back toward the cerebellum, as well as these reticular formation nuclei that are present there in the pons. And last but not least, part of the brain stem, we get to the midbrain. So remember, we had hindbrain and midbrain and forebrain. Hindbrain is the pons and the medulla oblongata. The midbrain is, well, the midbrain. We don't have another name for it. And then we'll talk about the forebrain in a few moments here. So our midbrain, this obviously connects the hindbrain to the forebrain. It's the midbrain, it's in between, right? Kind of like a duh. It continues to have that reticular formation. Again, these controls of these basic functions. It also contains the cerebral aqueduct. You remember we talked about that yesterday? That little pathway, the little river flowing between the 3rd and the 4th ventricles. That's contained there in the midbrain. There are a couple of the motor nuclei for the nerves that control your eye movements, cranial nerve 3 and cranial nerve 4, that are contained there in the midbrain. Here are pictures. So you can see the very top part of this brain stem. Attached to the midbrain are those cerebral peduncles, these anterior midbrain stalks that anchor the cerebrum to the brain stem. It's not that your cerebrum would just float away if it wasn't for these things, but it's just the connection between the cerebrum, which is, again, the big part that most of us think about when we think about brains, connecting to that brain stem. Another picture, so you can see, here is that midbrain, right here. Kind of, again, forming that bridge between the hindbrain, the pons medulla, and the cerebrum. They spent some time on the different pieces of the cerebral peduncles. I am not interested in you knowing these pieces, but you can see on the cross section where they are and how they work. These are just different centers, different pieces of this midbrain. If only they were actually colored like this in the body itself, it would make things much easier, frankly. It'd be much nicer. Let's talk briefly about this reticular formation, because we keep mentioning it, but it deserves its own comment here. And this is centers throughout the brainstem that control a number of things. And again, it runs all the way vertically through the brainstem. So even though we have 3 different areas, this reticular formation runs through the whole thing. Sir? It's like that, the color that they have present there. So if you look at, Trying to find you a good picture. Like, so on page 512, they have a sliced open brain. Or page 508, they have an actual preserved brain. Again, it's kind of this grayish, whitish, you know, it's very dull. It's not terribly exciting. It's just neurons, right, for the most part. It's just neurons. So this reticular formation has got connections with a bunch of different places in the cerebrum because it has so many different functions that it does that the rest of the brain is affected by it. They show you this picture there on page 518 in your textbook where, like, here is the centerpiece for all of these important activities, and it sends signals out to the cerebrum. It accepts information from the cerebrum. It's kind of like that coordinator of all these different pieces. So what does it do? There's a whole huge list. You don't have to know this whole list. I broke it down a little bit for you in the study guide, but I want to go through quickly with you all these different kind of things that this reticular formation does. So the first is somatic motor control. So here are the kind of things: adjusting muscle tone and balance and posture so that, you know, you can actually stand up and not like fall over. Relaying signals from the eyes and the ears to the cerebellum, which we'll talk more about what the cerebellum does. Integrating visual, auditory, balance, and motion stimuli into motor coordination. Have you ever watched somebody who has had a brain injury try to walk or try to move? It's very difficult. We move around like it's nothing, but this act of taking my finger and touching my nose, that is not easy. The coordination to not like poke myself in the eye or put it in my mouth, it's impressive. We take it for granted, but it is. The next is our gaze centers, to allow our eyes to track objects and to fixate on them and move as they're moving. That is a skill that this reticular formation helps control. Pattern generators for breathing. Our cardiovascular control. Pain modulation to help cut down on the amount of pain that's being sent up. It kind of like deadens the pain as needed, like an analgesic. Sleep and consciousness. This is the part of your brain that plays a central role in when you sleep and how you wake up and how you maintain consciousness. Here is, if I have an injury to this area of the reticular formation, it could put you in a coma that you would never wake up from because you've damaged this section. I would say yes, definitely. If there was an issue in those areas, that could be a problem for you. Yeah, pretty rare. There's a tumor there or something like that, sure. Habituation is another one. So repetitive, inconsequential stimuli. Let me ask you this. Can you feel your socks?
Yes.
Did you feel them before I asked you to feel them? You had basically turned it off, right? If we're not wearing socks, let's talk about one of your undergarments. Can you feel the elastic? Okay, now that you think about it, sure, you can, right? But your brain has basically said, hey, that stimuli doesn't mean anything. It doesn't help me in any way. I'm just going to ignore it. Does that make sense? But if I point it out to you, oh yeah, sure enough, I can feel the top ribbon on my socks, though it's falling down, right? And that's what the reticular formation is doing. That's what we call habituation. You're getting used to it. All right, let's move into the cerebellum. We're moving down, still in the midbrain here. So my hindbrain was my medulla and my pons. My midbrain is my midbrain, and the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is the largest part of that brain stem area, and the second largest part in the whole brain. And it has two hemispheres, just like the cerebrum does, that's connected by this vermis, this central canal running through it. It's got more than half of the brain's neurons, about 100 billion neurons, that are rolling through this cerebellum here. The cerebellum means little brain. It's just the teeny brain, like the cerebellum, oh, it's so small and so beautiful, right? You've got these cerebellar peduncles, or peduncles, which again are these stalks that are connecting the brainstem and the cerebellum to carry the signals back and forth between these guys. And there's an inferior, middle, and a superior. They have different pieces. Here's a picture where you can see it in action, right? So here is the cerebellum with a vermis connection right down the center there. This is your typical view where they take and slice the cerebellum, again in the kind of the sagittal plane, and it kind of looks like a tree, doesn't it? And I'm assuming when we see our brains, you should be able to see this very nicely. This nice arbor vitae, as they call it, the tree of life.
So is the cerebellum part of the hindbrain or the midbrain?
Well, so right, I said mid, but it said hind there, didn't it? I'm going to go with what they have written there.
So there are like 4 parts to the hindbrain?
I guess so. I was thinking it was part of the mid. But let's check to make sure. It says largest part of hindbrain, so there you go. Midbrain is midbrain, I guess. Thank you for catching that. Pictures of the cerebellum from the cadavers. You see it kind of just hanging out back on the back here. Just inside the skull on this posterior section, right below your occipital lobe. Nice view from the bottom upward. These nice bulges of the cerebellum. So, how I learned the cerebellum was that the cerebellum was important for motor control, coordination, and locomotion. So in other words, when you think about somebody dancing, and that smoothness, and that control, and that grace, that's the cerebellum working. It's not actually telling the muscles to move, but it's coordinating the smoothness of that. Now, does that mean those of us who can't dance have no cerebellar control? No. We're just not blessed with that smoothness, right? But it actually does way more than that. It's not just simply about coordination and locomotor control. These recent studies have revealed many more functions that the cerebellum plays. Sensory, linguistic, which means speaking, emotional, and other non-motor functions. So here's a couple of them. To be able to compare textures. So for me to come over and say, with my eyes closed, oh, this is paper, huh? And this, oh, no, this is a plasticky kind of hardness. Are you with me? I'm comparing these two textures, and that's my cerebellum. That's helping to make that judgment between them. To be able to perceive space. In other words, can I take and put things from one something into another something? But with my eyes closed. They're using a pegboard to do this, right? Where you're putting, you know, like those things at, what's the name of that restaurant where you have the things there that you guys hate to eat at? Cracker Barrel, thank you. Yes, my kids hate that restaurant. I enjoy it very much, but there's very little for vegetarians there. Okay? Recognizing objects from different views, keeping judge of elapsed time. So this part of your brain that's the timekeeper, you know, that lets you know it's been a long time since Mr. Hess started talking and I'm really ready for this class to be over with. That's your cerebellum. That's working. It's well done. Directing your eye movements, judging the pitch of tones, and distinguishing between spoken words. Like if you have words that sound similar. Are you with me? Planning, scheduling. Tons more than just simple coordination. So again, what I learned when I was in school was that the cerebellum was all about coordination and about motor control, but so much more. It makes you wonder how much more of the brain, like, do we really not know? More than we think. Showing you some MRI studies, showing you the different pieces of the brain lit up. And again, I would encourage you to take a peek at this online that you can see. So that moves us into the forebrain. The forebrain, if you're with me still in your textbook now, We're over on to page 521. And the forebrain is two parts. The diencephalon and the cerebrum. So if we're looking at the picture here, cerebrum and diencephalon inside there. The diencephalon, rarely will you hear people talk about just as a singular something. You hear it talked about more about its pieces, and I'm sure you've heard of these before. The thalamus and the hypothalamus. The epithalamus we rarely talk about, but the first two are pretty solid. These are very commonly talked about brain pieces. So we'll start with the thalamus. The thalamus is an ovoid mass on each side of the brain that's just beneath the cerebral hemispheres. And it makes up most of the diencephalon, this thalamus piece. And there are 23 different nuclei that are there in this thalamus. And again, those nuclei are the nuclei from the neurons, right? So these are the control centers for these different neurons. And all of your input, it's basically, your textbook calls it the gateway to the cerebral cortex. So all of these pathways, all of the fibers have to pass through this thalamus in order to get to the cerebrum. This would be like the Mrs. Maddox of our brain, right? You got to go past me. You want to go see the principal. You want to go see someone. You got to go through Mrs. Maddox. She'll send you where you need to go. Does that make sense? It plays a key role in relaying those signals, as we said. It also has some involvement in memory and emotional functions of the limbic system, which we'll talk about more as we go through. So here's the thalamus. Just above that top, so right here's the pons right there, there's the midbrain, and here's the thalamus just above that. Here's our hypothalamus, just a bit anterior to that. That's our next piece we're talking about. So this actually forms part of the walls and the floor of that third ventricle. And it contains mammillary bodies, like mammary glands. Yes, that's what they're named for. That's what they look like when you see them. So these are relaying these signals to the from the limbic system to the thalamus. It's the major control centers of the endocrine system. Showing you right here, hypothalamus is this guy right there. Thalamus above it, much larger. And then a little bit more anteriorly is the hypothalamus. So it's a major control center for the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system, the automatic stuff, right? The automatic responses in our body, things we don't control consciously, as well as the endocrine system. By the way, there's a number of you, when I was grading your tests, your unit tests, that was mixing up endocrine and integumentary. I'd asked you tell me about how the nervous system works with the integumentary system, and some of you were talking about immunity and hormones, and that's endocrine, lymphatic, just so you knew. Those are up, by the way. I sent you a message yesterday, but both chapter 13 and your unit tests are both up. The functions of this hypothalamic nuclei, and this is a key piece. The hypothalamus plays a huge role in the endocrine system. Remind me, what does the endocrine system do? Hormones, right? The hypothalamus is the nervous system part that controls the endocrine system. So as it produces hormones, those hormones go down to the anterior pituitary, which the anterior pituitary is the gland that basically controls the whole rest of the endocrine system. Does that make sense? So this is the nervous system piece that's controlling the endocrine system. It also produces hormones that work to the posterior pituitary as well. We'll talk more about these in the future. It influences heart rate and blood pressure and gastrointestinal secretions and movements. It's an impressive piece. This little piece, this hypothalamus, does a lot of different things. Let's keep going. Other functions that it has is thermoregulation. So your hypothalamus is like your thermostat in your body. It's what determines whether you get too hot or too cold. Some of us have very high running thermostats. Some folks have very cold running thermostats. Our food and water intake. This is what regulates hunger and thirst in your body. It tells you when you need to drink more. It tells you when you need to eat. It tells you when you're hungry, when you're not hungry, right? It's a big part of sleep and circadian rhythms. This rhythm, you realize that's the big difficulty with those of us who stay up super late on the weekends and then try and get into a normal schedule on the weekdays. You're totally messing up your rhythm. What us old people realize is, okay, you just kind of get up at the same time each day. It's a pain in the butt sometimes. There are some Sundays I would sure like to sleep in. But I'm awake. Let's go. Let's get things done. Let's go golfing. Let's go do something. Right? You just called that one? Yes, good. Memory is another piece that this hypothalamus plays a part on. And then emotional behavior and sexual response, anger, aggression, fear, pleasure, contentment, sexual drive, all controlled there through the hypothalamus. It's pretty impressive. Here's a closer look at that hypothalamus. So these colored pieces right here, and again, this is in your textbook there on page 522. They're showing you the thalamus above that, and then the hypothalamus below it. And you see that right attached here is the pituitary gland. Again, that master gland for the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus is right present to influence that pituitary gland. Hypothalamus pictures on the cadavers. Our MRI pieces that are showing the different places there. The epithalamus, I don't even think I included this. I did not. Because it really is a very small little mass of tissue that has the pineal gland, which we'll talk about once we do the endocrine system. I figured there wasn't any reason to really spend much time there. And the epithalamus, you can see it right here on the posterior side, just above the cerebellum. There's the pineal gland. And now we get to the piece everybody really cares about. The cerebrum, right? When you think of brain, this is what you think of. You think of the cerebrum. It's the largest, most conspicuous piece of this brain. Are you comfortable? The cerebrum is really what makes us human. Maybe sometimes you've heard the brain stem is like your animal brain. Has anybody ever heard this before? And then this cerebrum is what actually makes us human. In some ways, I agree with that. Because anything that's alive is going to have all those brainstem functions, right? It has to breathe. It has to have a heartbeat. It has to be able to sleep and eat, and right? But this thinking, this planning, this judgment, that's what makes us human, right? So remember, it's divided by this longitudinal fissure into two cerebral hemispheres. Don't forget about the corpus callosum, that tract that connects the two sides. Don't forget about the gyri and the sulci. The gyri are the mounds, right? The hills. And the sulci, the valleys, right? And this gives larger amounts of information processing capability because I've got more space. I've got more area there. And we've got 5 lobes in this cerebrum. I'm curious, do you know them? Did you, before you looked at the sheet? You knew one of them. The good news is you learned these names already. Because these are the names of the bones. Right? It's the same thing. So the bone right here is called what? The frontal bone. The lobe underneath that is called the frontal lobe. Right? These bones on the side over here are called the parietal bones. The lobe of the brain underneath that is the parietal lobe. You see the pattern, right? So here's that view showing you frontal lobe. The central sulcus is this guy here that runs kind of horizontally. Our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, the longitudinal fissure that runs right down the center of your brain. Brainstem on the bottom, cerebellum on the back, temporal lobe, right? Your temples, right? This area right here, temporal lobe. Showing you actual pictures, the cerebral hemispheres, and then that longitudinal fissure running right down the middle. Okay, the cerebrum. I'm actually going to put up this diagram because this is the one that I like. This is on page 523. Whew. And this was a tough one. Yes, sir? Mm-hmm. Sure, right. You're increasing blood flow in that area. Yeah, yeah. Doesn't mean it takes it away immediately, but sure, that's helpful. Definitely. All right, so your textbook does this really nice job. I'm actually going to kind of almost read to you this piece here. All right? This is on page 523. It is difficult to summarize the functions of the cerebral lobes in a simple way. Many functions such as vision, memory, speech, and emotion are distributed over multiple lobes, and different lobes contribute only part of the overall function. Does that make sense what they're saying? In other words, there's not one place that does this, even though I'm about ready to show you places for each of these different things. Does that make sense? We've seen, how many of you did the book on Phineas Gage back in your 8th grade year, right? If you, oops, sorry. Hold on one second here. So Phineas Gage, if you remember this story, was a gentleman who was working on the railroads, right? And they were packing in these explosives to blow up rock to allow this railroad to go through. And to do this, you have this long, very heavy steel rod that they would use to break and push down and pack things in. Well, there was an explosion that happened unexpectedly, and that rod literally went right straight up through his head, through his brain, and out. Okay? But he lived, amazingly. Because again, this was back in the 1800s. And they studied his brain and his personality, the changes that happened to him based upon what parts of his brain were affected. Those of you, I guess I don't think it was for your class we didn't do this, but we've been, with the last number of classes, I've had the 8th graders come into the lab and we've actually dissected little brains, these little sheep brains that we're going to work on tomorrow. And you see, not tomorrow, on Monday, that you see what places would have been affected. And it significantly affected his personality, affected his function. Eventually, but not because of this. Like that injury was not what killed him. He lived a number of years after that. Amazingly, yeah. So I say all of that because we're going to list a bunch of functions, and we're oversimplifying, is what I'm trying to say. We can't say, ooh, this part right here, that does memory. No, it's a whole bunch of different pieces together. Does that make sense? All right. So, let's start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is your consciousness. Okay? It's what really makes you human. When you talk about someone's frontal lobe, that's really like their personality pieces come there. It's also where they do abstract thinking, right? You're trying to imagine, have this piece of paper and fold it these different ways, right? Like those stupid SAT questions, right? This is you're using frontal lobe to do that. Some are better than others. This is also the place where you make your decisions. Your cognitive pieces are there in your frontal brain. Your emotional processes are mostly there. Though already today we mentioned 2 or 3 other places that are involved in emotions, right? But this is kind of the overriding control of those emotions. Your mood, your motivation. For you folks, when I think of you and frontal lobe, I think of decision making. We call it executive functions. Can you stay organized? Can you make a plan? Can you know when a test is coming and be prepared for it on time? Can you know when assignments are due and actually go through the steps in order to complete them? Are you with me? Executive level, executive functions is what we're dealing with there. Boy, what else? Your speech, production, what actually controls your speech being produced is there in the frontal lobe. As well as your motor control. Like when I ask you to raise your arm over your head, that is your frontal lobe that is sending those signals to move your arm. We'll talk more about those in the future. Pretty important, eh? Frontal lobe, pretty impressive. But not to be outdone, the parietal lobe has got a nice set of functions as well. The parietal lobe, again, that's this piece back here, just posterior to that central sulcus. This is your sensation. So pain, heat, your touch. This is where you feel with your hands and the rest of your body. It goes to that parietal lobe of your brain. Taking many different senses and integrating them together, like taste, is not just simply taste. I ask you this, when you have a cold, does your food taste different?
Yeah, it doesn't taste
It doesn't taste as good, right? It's very flat, very bland, because smell is a huge part of taste. So we're integrating these things. Are you with me? Feel, texture, the taste of your food, like actually the composition of it plays a role in how it tastes as well. Like my mom can't eat broccoli. She hates broccoli. Not because it tastes bad, but the texture, she just doesn't like it. She's weird, but that's all right. It's my mom. What else does this parietal lobe do? Spatial. Oh, autocorrect. On your study guide it says special perception. It's not like a superpower. It's supposed to be spatial. All right, so if you want to cross that, I'll change it when I give you the updated study guide. But it's spatial perception. And language processing. The part of your brain that allows you to hear my words and make them understandable. That is in your parietal lobe. We continue on. The occipital lobe in the very back of your head has really one big function, and that's vision. Making you able to process what you're seeing, being aware and understanding what you're seeing. That's your occipital lobe. Is it kind of strange that your eyes are up here and your processing place is way back here? Seems a little weird, but that's the way it rolls. Temporal lobe on the side here makes sense. You'll be dealing with hearing. That's a big thing because the ears are right there. Your smell, your emotion, your learning, your vocabulary, you're taking memories and consolidating them and accessing them and using them. Temporal lobe. Lots of pieces there for the temporal. Your learning to be able to comprehend a language is there in your temporal lobe. And last but not least, this little tiny guy called the insula does taste and pain and visceral sensation, consciousness, emotional responses, empathy, all dealt with in that insula, this little kind of lobe tucked underneath the rest. I'm impressed, my friend. That's a lot of stuff to go through in one day. There's your cerebrum, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe, and then the insula tucked underneath here. Got MRIs that are showing them lit up, the different pieces. Frontal lobe, insula, temporal, frontal, parietal, occipital, the coronal plane, our white matter and gray matter, which we're going to talk about the next time we are together. Any questions that you have for me, my friends? A lot of good stuff. All right.